and don't ever come back!
I'm not. You're standing on my property.
He grabbed the microphone from the event coordinator's hand without warning, no hesitation, no apology, and tapped it twice against his palm to silence the ballroom. 300 people turned. Damien Ashford smiled the way a man smiles when he's already won. 10 years ago, he said, voice smooth and carrying, I made the worst investment of my life. Tonight, I'm finally cutting my losses. He looked directly at Vivian, not with anger, with boredom. The divorce papers are already filed, sweetheart. Security will help you find the door. The room went silent. Somewhere near the back, a champagne flute hit the marble floor and shattered. If you've ever watched someone destroy themselves in slow motion while believing they were winning, stay until the end of this story. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Vivian's story has traveled. The theme for the Ashford 10th Anniversary Gala was a decade of triumph. That was the phrase printed on the invitations. Embossed gold lettering on ivory cardstock, mailed 6 weeks in advance to 300 guests who represented the architecture of Damien Ashford's world. Investors, city council members, business editors, the kind of people who were invited not because they were friends, but because they were useful and who understood the distinction perfectly well and came anyway. The Ashford estate sat on 11 acres in the kind of neighborhood where the houses were set so far back from the road that you couldn't see them from the street, only the long private driveways curving away into landscaped dark. The mansion itself was a monument to the version of success that needed witnesses. 4 stories of glass and imported limestone, a ballroom that could seat 400, a wine cellar that had been featured in 2 architecture magazines. Damien had overseen every detail of its renovation personally. He'd fired 3 interior designers before finding one who understood what he wanted, which was for every room to announce quietly but unmistakably that its owner was not to be underestimated. Vivian had lived in the house for 10 years. She had never once felt it belonged to her. She'd spent the afternoon of the anniversary helping the caterers arrange the centerpieces because one of the staff was running late, and she didn't want the florist to feel unsupported. That was Vivian's way. She moved through the edges of things, handling the details that other people overlooked, doing it without needing anyone to notice. She wore a midnight blue dress she'd bought 6 months ago and saved for the occasion. Her hair was pulled back simply. She wasn't the kind of woman who walked into a room and silenced it. She was the kind of woman who, once you really looked at her, you couldn't stop watching. Damien had stopped looking at her somewhere around year 3. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom was full, the string quartet was playing something classical and unobtrusive, and the champagne was moving. Damien worked the room the way he always did. Hand extended before he reached you, eye contact calibrated to suggest you were the most important person he'd spoken to all evening, laugh timed perfectly. He was good at it. He'd been good at it for 20 years, and the performance was so polished by now that he probably didn't think of it as performance anymore. Vivian watched him from near the bar, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched. She'd watched him work rooms for a decade. She knew every beat of it. When he shifted weight to his left foot, he was getting bored. When his jaw tightened slightly between sentences, he was calculating something. When he laughed with his head tilted back, it was real. He almost never laughed that way anymore. Her friend Caroline appeared at her elbow. Caroline was one of the few people at the gala Vivian considered an actual friend, a landscape architect she'd met years ago through a charitable land preservation committee, someone who talked to her like a person rather than an extension of her husband. You look like someone waiting for a train that's already been canceled, Caroline said. Vivian smiled. I'm fine. You're doing the thing where you say you're fine and mean something entirely different. I'm doing the thing where I'm standing at my own anniversary party and trying to get through it. Caroline studied her for a moment. Is something happening tonight? You've been, I don't know, careful. I'm always careful. You've been different careful, like you're waiting for something. Vivian didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. At 8:30, Damien took the microphone. She watched him cross the room toward the bandstand. She watched him lift the mic from the coordinator's hand without asking. She watched him tap it against his palm and smile, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, not quite grief, something in between. a door closing. A decision that had been made a long time ago finally arriving at its destination. She heard every word he said. She watched 300 people absorb the shock of it. She saw the exact moment the room understood what was happening. That collective flinch, the held breath, the sideways glances at her that people tried to make invisible. She didn't cry. She didn't move. When the security guard, a young man named Terrence, whom she'd always treated decently, who looked mortified by what he'd been asked to do, approached her with an expression of genuine apology, she set her glass of sparkling water down carefully on the nearest table. "It's all right, Terrence," she said quietly. "I know the way out." And she walked through the ballroom with her head level and her pace unhurried, and the crowd parted without her having to ask, and she didn't look back at Damien Ashford once. Outside, the rain had started. She stood beneath the portico while one of the valets went for her car, listening to the water come down hard on the limestone steps. Behind her, through the tall windows, she could see the ballroom beginning to resume its movement, conversations restarting, glasses being refilled, the string quartet easing back into something ambient. The gala would survive the interruption. Events like this always did. Scandal was almost a form of entertainment for crowds like that. The valet brought her a gray sedan, her own car, the practical one she drove herself, not one of Damien's. She tipped him $20 from her purse and sat in the car for a moment before she started it, rain drumming on the roof. Her phone lit up with a text from a number she recognized. Her attorney. "Everything's set. Documents file at 9 a.m. She typed back, "Good." Then she started the car and drove away from the Ashford estate, watching the gates disappear in her rearview mirror. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel devastated either. She felt tired in the particular way of someone who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been able to put it down. Damien Ashford had first seen Vivian Hale at a charity auction in the spring, 14 years ago now, though it had started to feel like something from a different life. She was working behind one of the registration tables, checking names off a list, doing it efficiently and without looking up. He'd stopped in front of her table and she'd asked for his name without glancing at him first, which was unusual enough that it caught his attention. He pursued her the way he pursued everything, methodically, with confidence, with the assumption that the outcome was already decided. She resisted him longer than anyone he'd dated, which he interpreted as a feature rather than a warning. They were engaged within 2 years. Married the third. What Damien understood about Vivian, or believed he understood, was that she was steady, reliable. She had a background in finance. She'd done her graduate work in forensic accounting, of all things, but she'd set that aside after the wedding. She managed the household. She sat on charitable committees. She was polite to his business associates and never made scenes and handled the logistics of their life together with a quiet competence that he came to rely on without ever consciously appreciating. He didn't know because he'd never thought to ask that she was still doing forensic accounting, just not for anyone else. He didn't know that the quiet woman who organized the caterers and drove herself in a gray sedan had been, for 9 years, reading every document that moved through his business empire and building a record that would have taken a federal task force 18 months to assemble on their own. He didn't know any of that because he had decided years ago that she wasn't worth paying attention to. That was the miscalculation, not a tactical error, a fundamental one. The prenuptial agreement had been Damien's idea, drafted by his own attorneys, and he considered it airtight. In the event of divorce, Vivian would receive a single lump sum payment, generous by normal standards, essentially a rounding error against his actual holdings, and she would have no claim on the business, the properties, the assets accumulated during the marriage. His lawyers had reviewed it 4 times. His financial advisor had called it the most protective personal legal structure he'd ever seen for a client at Damien's wealth level. He felt good about that. He felt, if he was being honest, satisfied. Because the thing about Damien Ashford was that he didn't like loose ends. He didn't like uncertainty. He'd built his empire on the principle that every situation could be controlled if you understood it well enough, and the prenup was his way of applying that principle to his marriage. It said essentially, this relationship has defined parameters, and within those parameters, my risk is bounded. He'd told his lead attorney, Marcus Webb, to make sure she walks away with enough to be comfortable but not enough to be trouble. Marcus had done exactly that, or believed he had. What neither Damien nor Marcus had thought to investigate, what it apparently hadn't occurred to anyone on his legal team to check, was the land. Not the mansion. The land. The 11 acres on which the Ashford estate sat had been purchased 40 years ago by a woman named Eleanor Hale, Vivian's grandmother, through a family land trust that predated Vivian's birth by 2 decades. Eleanor had bought the parcel in a private sale at a time when the neighborhood was less developed, and the price was a fraction of what it would later become. And she had transferred the land into the Hale family trust, with careful, explicit documentation that specified it could only pass to direct female descendants of the Hale line. When Vivian's parents died, she inherited the trust. She was 19 years old at the time. When Damien purchased the mansion 12 years ago, the structure itself, the building, the glass and limestone monument that he believed defined him, he purchased it from a property developer who had built on land he was leasing without fully disclosing that fact in the sale documentation. It was a detail that had been buried in the title history, obscured through a series of transactions that looked clean on the surface. Vivian had discovered it in year 2 of their marriage while helping organize some paperwork Damien needed for a refinancing. She'd pulled the original title chain out of curiosity. She was a forensic accountant by training. She pulled title chains the way some people read the back of cereal boxes. And she'd found it. A ground lease, expired and never renewed, with her grandmother's trust listed as the reversionary owner. She'd sat with that document for 3 days before she called her grandmother's attorney, a quiet man named Harold Briggs, who was 81 years old and still sharp. "Did you know?" she asked him. "I wondered if you'd find it eventually," he said. "Your grandmother wondered too. She left some instructions if you're interested." She was interested. She didn't tell Damien. She put the document in a safety deposit box at a bank in a different city, and she went back to organizing the household, and she started paying closer attention to everything. The night of the gala, while Damien was accepting congratulations from his remaining guests on the boldness of his announcement, there were people who genuinely said this, who seemed to admire the spectacle of it. Vivian was sitting in her grandmother's house 30 minutes away. Eleanor Hale had died 4 years earlier, but she'd left the house to Vivian directly, outside the trust, and Vivian had kept it. Damien knew it existed. He'd visited twice and found it beneath him, too small, too old, the furniture too worn, and never went back. He assumed Vivian kept it for sentimental reasons, which he considered a female weakness he'd learned to tolerate. She used it as an office. The kitchen table was covered in neat stacks of folders. On the counter, her laptop was open to a secure file transfer application. Her attorney had been there earlier that afternoon for a final review and had left 3 hours ago after saying, "I've been practicing for 30 years and I've never seen preparation like this." Vivian had said, "I had time." Now she sat alone in the kitchen her grandmother had cooked in for 50 years, listening to the rain hit the windows, and she made herself a cup of tea she didn't really want because it was something to do with her hands. Her phone rang. It was Caroline. "Are you all right?" Caroline asked immediately. "I'm okay. That was... Vivian, what he did was barbaric, in front of 300 people. I'm so sorry." "Don't be." A pause. "You don't seem surprised." "No." "Vivian." Another pause, longer this time. "Is something about to happen?" She thought about Harold Briggs, about the safety deposit box, about 9 years of documents in waterproof folders in a storage unit that was registered under her grandmother's trust rather than her own name, about the very specific legal clause that Damien's attorneys had never bothered to look for because they'd assumed the land had always been his. "Something already happened," she said. "Tonight just made it official." Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then, "Should I be worried about you?" "No," Vivian said. "I think I'm finally going to be fine." She meant it. For the first time in a long time, she genuinely meant it. Outside, the rain fell harder on the roof of Eleanor Hale's small, worn, impeccably loved house. And inside, Vivian Hale drank her tea and waited for morning. The morning after the gala, Damien Ashford woke up in a good mood for the first time in months. He lay in the center of the California king bed. His bed, in his room, in his house, and stared at the ceiling with the particular satisfaction of a man who had finally done something he'd been putting off too long. The rain from the previous night had cleared. Pale October light came through the tall windows. Somewhere below he could hear the household staff beginning their morning routines, the distant sound of the kitchen activating, coffee being made. He reached for his phone. 17 missed calls, reporters mostly, a few business associates who'd been at the event and wanted to either congratulate him or make sure they were still in his good graces. 2 from his publicist Janet, who had no doubt spent the night preparing a statement. 1 from Marcus Webb, his attorney, time-stamped at 11:43 the previous night. He'd call Marcus later. Right now, he wanted coffee. He was halfway through his first cup, standing at the kitchen island in a robe that cost more than most people's monthly rent, when his phone rang again. Marcus. He answered on the 3rd ring. "You're up early," Damien said. "I've been up since 6. Marcus's voice had a texture Damien didn't like. Tight, careful, the voice of a man choosing each word before he said it. "We need to talk." "We're talking now." "In person. This morning." Damien set down his coffee. "What is it?" "I'd rather—" "Marcus." His tone shifted, just slightly. It was enough. Everyone who worked with Damien Ashford long enough learned to read that shift. "Tell me now." A pause. "We received a legal filing this morning from an attorney representing the Hale Family Trust." The name landed strangely. He knew the word Hale. It was Vivian's name, her family name, the one she'd kept hyphenated for certain documents, but he'd never heard it attached to the word trust before. "What kind of filing?" "Property claim," Marcus said. "Damien, it's about the land, the estate land." Damien almost laughed. "That's not possible. I own the estate." "You own the structure." A pause that felt about 10 years long. "There's a ground lease in the original title chain, expired 18 years ago and never renewed. The reversionary rights belong to a trust established by Eleanor Hale in 1974. Vivian is the sole beneficiary and trustee." The kitchen felt very quiet all of a sudden. "That can't be right," Damien said. "I've had 2 people looking at it since 5 this morning. It's right. My attorneys reviewed that title when I bought the property, said." "They reviewed what was disclosed," Marcus said. "The developer who sold you the property buried the lease documentation in a subsidiary transfer that wasn't flagged during standard review. It was, honestly, Damien, it was negligent on our part. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Damien put his hand flat on the kitchen island and stared at the surface of it. Italian marble. He'd chosen it himself. "What does this mean practically?" "It means she owns the land under your house, the driveway, the utility easements, the perimeter acreage, all of it." Another pause. "And her attorneys have filed a formal notice of claim, which means we can't ignore it or slow walk it. They're moving fast." "How fast?" "They've already contacted the county. There's a surveyor coming this afternoon." He stood there for a moment with his hand on the marble countertop and tried to locate the version of this situation that made sense, the angle from which it looked manageable. He couldn't find one. "Get here by 10, he said, and ended the call. He stood alone in his kitchen for a long time after that, his coffee going cold beside him, the morning light moving across the floor. No. Marcus Webb arrived at 9:40 with a leather briefcase and an associate named Diane, who carried a second briefcase and hadn't been told to speak unless spoken to. Damien met them in the study, his study, with the built-in shelves and the desk that had been custom-made from reclaimed timber, the room that appeared in the background of every profile photo he'd ever approved for publication. Marcus laid out the documents in a neat row across the desk. He was a trim man in his late 50s who had been Damien's attorney for 11 years and had seen Damien angry many times, but something in his posture suggested he was preparing for a variety he hadn't encountered before. Damien looked at the documents. He picked up the original ground lease, 40 years old, the paper fragile at the edges, the language formal and precise. He read the reversionary clause twice. He set it down. "Who drew this up?" he asked. The original document was prepared by an attorney named Harold Briggs on behalf of Eleanor Hale. Marcus cleared his throat. "Briggs is still practicing, apparently. He's listed as co-counsel on the filing alongside a firm called Callaway and Reese. They specialize in property trust litigation. She had this prepared. Damien's voice was flat. This wasn't something she stumbled onto. The filing is extremely organized, Marcus said carefully. The documentation is complete. Chain of title, trust formation records, the expired lease, communications attempting to establish a renewal that were apparently never answered by the developer. It reads like something that's been assembled over a significant period of time. How long? Marcus hesitated. The earliest dated internal memorandum we can see in the filing is from approximately 9 years ago. The room was very quiet. 9 years. They had been married for 10. She had found it in year 2 or thereabouts, and had spent 9 years building a case while handing him his coffee in the morning and coordinating caterers for his business dinners. Damien leaned back in his chair. He had the expression of a man who had just bitten into something and discovered it was not what he thought it was. Not rage yet, not entirely, but the precursor to it, a cold recognition. "What can we do?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Contest the claim, obviously, but I need to be honest with you about our position, which is not strong. The documentation is solid, the trust is real. We've verified the formation records independently this morning. Eleanor Hale did own this land, and she did structure it as a perpetual family trust with specific inheritance conditions." Marcus paused. "There's also the matter of the expired lease and the failure to renew. The developer you bought from had an obligation to address that before the sale, and he didn't, which gives you a claim against him, but that doesn't resolve your immediate situation. Which is that Vivian Hale, as trustee of the Hale Family Trust, has a legitimate legal claim to the land on which this estate sits, including the driveway, the utility easements, the perimeter acreage, approximately 9 of your 11 total acres." He paused again. "She can restrict access. She can terminate utility easements. She can trap me in my own house," Damien said. Marcus didn't answer that, which was its own answer. The surveyor arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He was a heavy-set man named Gil, who drove a white pickup truck and had done nothing wrong in his life except show up for a job he'd been contracted for. But the look Damien gave him from the front steps could have stripped paint. "You need to leave," Damien said. Gil stopped walking and looked at his paperwork. "Sir, I've been engaged by the Hale Family Trust to—" "I know what you've been engaged to do. You're on my property." "Actually," Gil consulted his documents again, not because he needed to, but because it gave him somewhere to look other than at Damien. "The perimeter of the work order begins at the county road access, which is held under the trust filing. I'm technically— Get off my property." His voice had dropped in pitch, which was always worse than when he raised it. Gil took out his phone and made a call. He spoke quietly, listened for a moment, then held the phone out toward Damien. "She'd like to speak with you." Damien looked at the phone like it was an object he didn't recognize. Then he took it. "Vivian." He said her name the way you might say the name of an inconvenience. Her voice was calm, not triumphant, not cold, just level, the way she always was. The way that used to seem like passivity and now felt like something else entirely. "He has authorization to be there, Damien. Under the trust filing, we have survey rights to the property until this is resolved." "This is harassment. It's a legal proceeding. You're doing this because you're angry." "I'm not angry," she said. And the strange thing, the thing that landed badly, was that she sounded like she meant it. Not performing calm, actually calm. "Let Gil do his work. It'll take a couple of hours. He won't bother anyone. I will have you in court by end of week." "I know," she said. "I'm looking forward to it, actually." She hung up. He stood on his front steps holding a surveyor's phone and could not, for the first time in recent memory, think of what to do next. Marcus filed an emergency injunction the following morning, asking the court to pause any enforcement actions by the Hale Family Trust while the competing claims were evaluated. The judge, a woman named Rafferty who had the reputation of having no patience for procedural games, denied it within 4 hours, citing the completeness of the trust documentation and the legitimacy of the reversionary claim. She denied it in 4 hours, Damien said when Marcus called him. Her clerk told mine she found the documentation unusually well organized. Damien was in the study again, where he'd been spending most of his time over the past 2 days, surrounded by files his own team had pulled together in a hurry. They were not, he was realizing, going to out-prepare whatever Vivian had spent 9 years assembling. What's next? They've filed formal notice that they're terminating the expired utility easements as of Friday, unless we enter into a new lease agreement on their terms. Their terms being what? Fair market value for the land access, retroactive to the expiration of the original lease. Marcus's voice did the careful thing again. Damien, retroactive to the expiration would be substantial. How substantial? 18 years of fair market ground lease on 9 acres in this neighborhood. A pause. Somewhere between $4 and $6 million in back payments, depending on how the court values it, plus ongoing. The number sat in the air between them. She's dismantling me, Damien said. He said it without particular emotion, the way you'd describe a weather system. She has a legitimate legal... I know she has a legitimate legal claim, Marcus. I'm not asking you to argue with me about whether it's legitimate. I'm telling you what it is. A silence. Then Marcus said something Damien hadn't expected. Did you know? Before last night? Did you have any idea she'd found this? Damien thought about that. About the 10 years of mornings and evenings and dinners and events. About the woman who'd organized his caterers and sat quietly through his business dinners and driven herself in a gray sedan and never, not once, said anything that would have made him look twice. No, he said. I didn't know. By Thursday, the attorneys for the Hale Family Trust had sent formal notice to the 3 utility providers serving the Ashford estate, the electricity, the water, and the private road maintenance agreement that kept the driveway accessible from the county road. Each notice stated clearly and with full documentation attached that the easement rights held by the current structure's owner had expired and were no longer valid under the trust's reversionary claim, and that any continued service beyond the current billing cycle would need to be addressed through a new agreement with the trust. The utility companies, who had no stake in the dispute and no interest in being caught between 2 parties with expensive attorneys, responded with the conservatism you'd expect. They flagged the accounts, notified their legal departments, and one of them, the water company, sent a polite letter indicating they would need to see resolution of the competing claims before they could continue service under the current account structure. Damien called Vivian directly that night. She picked up after 2 rings. You're cutting off my water, he said. I'm not cutting off anything. The easement issue is a legal matter between you and the trust, which you control. Yes. Vivian. He stopped, tried again. He wasn't a man who asked for things easily. He'd built his entire identity on never needing to. But the situation was becoming something he hadn't anticipated, and he needed to at least understand the shape of it. What do you want? She was quiet for a moment. Not a hesitation. More like she was deciding whether to answer the real question or the tactical one. I want what's fair, she said finally. Which is what I've wanted for a long time. You just never asked before. I'm asking now. A little late, she said. Not cruelly, just factually. Have your attorneys call Calloway and Reese. They can discuss terms. And if I don't want to discuss terms, then by Friday the gates come down, she said. The trust has a right of physical access to inspect its property. We'll need to remove the current fence line along the perimeter of the trust acreage, which runs about 30 feet from your front door. A beat. And I'll have no choice but to let the utility situation resolve itself however the companies decide to handle it. He was quiet. I'm not enjoying this, Damien, she said, and the worst part was that her voice suggested it was true, that she was tired rather than satisfied. This isn't what I wanted when we got married, but you made choices, and I made choices. And here we are. She hung up again. He sat in his study for a long time. The 11 acres outside, or the 9 of them that apparently belonged to a trust his dead grandmother-in-law had established half a century ago, were dark and quiet in the October evening. The fountain ran. The exterior lights lit up the limestone face of the house. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. Nothing was the same as it always had been. Well, On Friday morning, a crew of 4 men arrived at 7 a.m. with equipment and a work order issued by the Hale Family Trust. They began removing the ornamental iron gates at the end of the driveway, not destroying them. The work order was specific about that. They were to be removed intact and stored because the gates themselves were attached to posts set in trust land, and their presence there without authorization was a matter the trust had decided to address. Damien watched from an upstairs window. His assistant, a young man named Tyler, who had joined the team 8 months ago and was still figuring out how to read the room, came to find him around 8 with a schedule for the day. "You're 9 o'clock with the Meridian Development Group," Tyler began. "Cancel it." "And the 11:30 Cancel everything today." Damien didn't look away from the window. "Call Janet and tell her I need a statement ready by noon about Tell her I need something about the property dispute that makes us sound like the aggrieved party, that we're cooperating with legal proceedings. Something." "Yes, sir." Tyler hovered. Is there anything else you need?" Damien finally looked at him. Tyler was 26, earnest, trying hard. He reminded Damien of himself at that age, which was not entirely a comfortable thing to notice. "No," Damien said. "Go do your job." Below, the iron gates came off their hinges with a sound he could feel more than hear, a low metallic groan that traveled up through the structure of the house. The crew worked efficiently. They weren't cruel about it. They were just doing what they'd been contracted to do, the same as Gil the surveyor, the same as the attorneys who'd filed the claim. All of them just doing their work as if this were any ordinary Friday. He watched one of the crew members photograph the gate posts. For the record, for the documentation that would become part of the case file. He thought about Vivian sitting in her grandmother's kitchen, that small, worn house he'd visited twice and dismissed, with folders spread across the table. 9 years of evenings, 9 years of careful, patient, meticulous work, all of it conducted quietly while he moved through his own life believing himself entirely in control. The gates were loaded onto a flatbed truck. The driveway stood open. Damien Ashford went downstairs, poured himself a coffee he didn't taste, and sat at the kitchen island where the marble was cold under his hands. And he understood, in a way that was still arriving, still settling into him like weather, that the woman he'd dismissed in front of 300 people 5 nights ago had not been waiting to be saved. She had been waiting for him to make exactly the move he'd made, and he had made it on schedule, in front of witnesses, into a microphone. The arrest didn't happen the way Damien would have imagined it, if he'd ever let himself imagine it. He'd pictured, in the abstract, in the way you picture things you believe will never actually occur, something dramatic. Agents surrounding the building, a perp walk in front of cameras. The kind of thing that happened to other men, worse men, men who had been sloppy or stupid or both. What actually happened was a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, when 2 federal agents in ordinary suits rang the front doorbell of the Ashford estate at 8:15 a.m. and stood on the doorstep that now had no gate in front of it, waiting with the patient stillness of people who had done this many times and were not in a hurry. Tyler answered the door because Damien had a call at 8:30 and Tyler had been briefed to handle arrivals. Tyler came to find him in the study with a face that had gone the color of old paper. "There are 2 men at the door," Tyler said. "They have badges." Damien was reading an email. He didn't look up immediately. "What kind of badges?" "Federal?" A pause. "They said it's about Ashford Capital." He closed his laptop. The agents introduced themselves as Hendricks and Park, out of the Financial Crimes Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office. They were courteous, which somehow made it worse. Hendricks, the older of the two, had the manner of a man who had arrested people across every income bracket and found the demeanor equally effective in all cases. He explained, standing in the entryway of the most expensive house Damien had ever built, that they had a warrant for his arrest on charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate securities violations. Damien said, "I need to call my attorney." "You'll have that opportunity," Hendricks said. "Standard procedure." He called Marcus from the back of the federal vehicle, sitting in his driveway, the open driveway, the one without gates, framed by the empty posts where the iron had been, watching his house get smaller through the rear window. Marcus answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "I know," Marcus said before Damien could speak. I'm already on my way. What do they have? A long pause. Too long. Marcus, a great deal, Marcus said carefully. We'll talk at the office. Touching. The federal building downtown had a particular quality of light, fluorescent and merciless, the kind that made everything look slightly worse than it was. Damien had been in federal buildings before, for regulatory meetings, for filings, for the ordinary business of running a company large enough to attract government interest. He had always been on the correct side of the table. He sat across from Hendricks and Park in a room that contained a table, 4 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner, and listened to them lay out in organized and methodical detail what the U.S. Attorney's Office believed Damien Ashford had done. The list was long. It began 8 years ago with a series of wire transfers from Ashford Capital accounts to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, a company that existed, on paper, as a consulting firm providing strategic services to Ashford Capital's development projects. The shell company had no employees, no office, no clients other than Ashford Capital, and it invoiced for services that could not be verified because they had never been rendered. The money that went into it came back into the system through a second layer of entities and eventually landed in a personal account that was not on any Ashford Capital disclosure. That was the beginning. Over the following years, the scheme expanded. Investor funds routed through false project accounts. Construction contracts paid to companies that were either dormant or controlled by intermediaries with ties to Damien. A series of bond offerings to private investors that had materially misrepresented the financial health of underlying properties. The total figure, as the government had calculated it, exceeded $40 million. Damien listened to all of this with his hands flat on the table and his face arranged into something that was intended to be neutral but kept slipping. When Hendricks finished, Damien said, I'd like to know where this information came from. Park, who had been quiet for most of the briefing, looked at him steadily. We're not required to disclose that at this stage. I understand what you're required to do, Damien said. I'm asking. Hendricks and Park exchanged the briefest possible glance. The investigation was initiated following the receipt of organized financial documentation submitted through an attorney representing a private party, Hendricks said. The documentation covered a period of approximately 8 years and was extensive. Damien was quiet for a moment. How extensive? Every transaction, Park said. Every transfer. Annotated. Cross-referenced. Organized by date, account, and entity. He paused, and something in his expression shifted into something that might have been, in a different setting, reluctant admiration. In 22 years, I've never seen a private submission that comprehensive. Damien thought about the kitchen table, the stacks of folders, 9 years of evenings in his grandmother-in-law's small house. He thought about Vivian sitting across from him at their own dinner table, year after year, quiet and unremarkable, and apparently reading every document that moved through his life. I see, he said. Job. Marcus got him out on bail by 4 that afternoon. A significant bond, the kind of number that required liquidating certain assets quickly, which caused its own cascade of problems. They sat in Marcus's conference room afterward, just the two of them, and Marcus poured 2 glasses of water and didn't touch his. Tell me the worst of it, Damien said. The documentation they received is... Marcus stopped, started again. Damien, whoever assembled this material had access to the internal accounting systems for Ashford Capital. Not just external records, internal, transaction-level data from accounts that should have required executive credentials to access. She was my wife, Damien said. She had access to everything. Did you know she had forensic accounting credentials? She mentioned it years ago. She said she'd set it aside. Marcus looked at him with an expression that was carefully free of judgment, which was its own form of judgment. She didn't set it aside. Damien put his hands around his water glass and stared at the table. No, she didn't. She had administrative access to the financial management software from the early years of the company. When you upgraded systems, the IT team migrated user credentials. It appears her access was never revoked. She was a quiet user. Login frequency was low enough that it didn't trigger any internal flags, but she was consistent. How long? Based on the login records the government subpoenaed, approximately 7 years. 7 years of logging into his financial systems from what he now understood was a kitchen table in a small house he'd visited twice and dismissed. 7 years of pulling transaction records, flagging anomalies, building the annotated cross-reference document trail that 2 federal agents had described as the most comprehensive private submission in their combined careers. She knew everything, Damien said. It came out quieter than he intended. Apparently. He sat with that. The weight of it was different from the land trust. That had been a legal surprise, a structural fact he hadn't known. This was something else. This was the understanding that the woman he'd dismissed as decorative had been sitting inside his life like a careful observer, watching, documenting, building towards something with the patience of someone who had a very clear idea of where they were going and no particular need to rush. "I need to talk to her," he said. Marcus's expression shifted. "Damien, I don't think that's... I'm not asking for your legal advice on this. I need to talk to her." Bokshat. Vivian agreed to meet him. That surprised him, though it probably shouldn't have. She was consistent, he was realizing. She'd always been willing to have a conversation. He'd been the one who'd stopped finding them worth having. They met at the offices of Calloway and Reese, which was her attorney's choice, and which meant they were on her ground, surrounded by her people, which he understood was intentional. He came with Marcus. She was already in the conference room when they arrived, sitting at one end of a long table with her attorney, a composed woman named Sandra Reese, who had the kind of stillness that suggested she had won a significant number of arguments in her life. Vivian looked the same as she always had. That was the thing. He didn't know what he'd expected. Some visible change, some outward signal of the transformation in their circumstances. But she was just Vivian. The same dark hair, the same way of sitting with her hands folded, the same expression that had always seemed like patience, and now seemed like something more calibrated than that. "Thank you for coming," she said. Not warmly, not coldly. He sat down. "I want to understand this." "Which part?" "All of it." He looked at her directly. "How long did you know?" She considered the question, which meant she was deciding how much of the true answer to give. "About the land? Since year 2? About the financial situation? I started seeing things that concerned me around year 3 and began keeping records." A pause. "I didn't go looking for what I found, Damien. I was trying to understand our tax exposure, and I found discrepancies I couldn't explain any other way." "You could have told me." Something moved across her face. It's her. Not quite disbelief. More like she was reviewing a memory she'd visited before. "I tried. Once. In year 4, I said I was seeing some inconsistencies in the Meridian account. Do you remember what you said?" He didn't, which was its own answer. "You told me to stay in my lane," she said. "That the accounting was handled, and I should focus on the things I was actually good at." She said it without particular bitterness, just as documentation. "So I did. I stayed in my lane. I just happened to have a very good view of everything from there." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Ashford." "Hail," she said. "I've filed to restore my name." Marcus paused. "Ms. Hale, my client would like to discuss whether there's a pathway to resolving some of these matters without the full legal proceeding. Given the property situation and now the federal..." "I understand what he'd like," Vivian said. She looked at Marcus briefly, then back at Damien. "The property matter is between the trust and Damien. That's not something I can negotiate in this room because the trust has obligations and beneficiaries. But you already know that." A pause. "The federal matter is out of my hands entirely. I submitted documentation to investigators. What they do with it is their decision." "You could contact them," Damien said. "Tell them there was context they're missing." "There isn't any context missing, Damien." Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it got quieter. "I gave them everything I had. Every transfer, every shell company, every false invoice. There's no exculpatory context because the transactions were what they were." The room was very still. "Why didn't you leave?" he said. It came out before he decided to say it. Years ago. If you knew, why stay? She was quiet for a moment, and this time the quiet felt different. Not calculating, not careful. Just a person sitting with something complicated. Because leaving without the right preparation would have left me with nothing and you with everything, she said finally. And because what you were doing was hurting people. Investors who believed you, people who trusted the company. That mattered to me more than... She stopped. I needed to be in a position to actually do something about it, not just walk away. He stared at her. So you stayed in a marriage for 9 years to build a fraud case. I stayed in a marriage for 9 years hoping things might change, she said. I built the fraud case because things didn't. She unfolded her hands, then refolded them. I'm not a saint, Damien. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I felt nothing about any of this. But I also couldn't watch you keep doing what you were doing and just leave quietly with a check. He didn't have an answer to that. Sandra Reese cleared her throat. I think we've covered what's useful for today. Damien looked at Vivian one more time. She met his eyes without flinching and without cruelty and without whatever he'd expected to find there. Triumph, satisfaction, relief. She just looked tired and resolved, like someone who had carried something a very long way and had finally put it down in the right place. The corporate revelation came through his own company's attorneys, a separate firm from Marcus that handled Ashford Capital's entity-level legal matters. They called an emergency board meeting 4 days after the arrest, at which Damien, still on bail, restricted from traveling, watching his public profile crater across every business publication that had ever celebrated him, was confronted with a document he hadn't known existed. In the original capitalization of Ashford Capital, 14 years earlier, the founding investment had come primarily from Damien's personal holdings. He'd always told that story with pride. Self-made, self-funded, built from the ground up. He told it so many times he'd stopped questioning the underlying facts. The underlying facts were different. The founding capital had included a substantial investment from an account in Vivian's name, a trust distribution she'd received from her grandmother at the time of Eleanor's death, which had occurred during the company's formation period. The investment had been structured as a convertible note, which had converted to equity at a predetermined threshold, which the company had hit in year 3. The note was in the original company documents. It had always been there. It had just been overlooked, buried, not mentioned in the narrative Damien had constructed about himself. The conversion meant Vivian Hale held a controlling stake in Ashford Capital. Damien heard this from the board's outside counsel, a man named Forsyth, who delivered the information with the careful neutrality of someone diffusing ordnance. How is that possible? Damien said. He was aware, distantly, that he'd been saying some version of that sentence repeatedly over the past 2 weeks. The convertible note was executed at founding, Forsyth said. It's in the original operating agreement. It was never rescinded or superseded. As the company grew, the conversion threshold was met and the equity vested automatically. Standard note terms. Why didn't your attorneys at the time were a small firm you've since moved away from. They drafted the documents correctly as far as we can tell. The note was valid. The conversion was valid. A pause. It appears this was simply not something that was revisited. Not something that was revisited. Because he'd never thought to revisit it. Because he'd never thought Vivian was paying attention. Because he'd looked at the woman across his breakfast table for 10 years and seen someone quiet and peripheral and manageable. She funded the company, Damien said. In significant part, yes. And she owns, pending formal legal determination, the equity stake from the converted note represents a controlling interest, yes. He sat with that in a way that was past shock now, into something quieter and more final. The company he'd spent 14 years building, the empire he'd described as self-made in every interview, every profile, every dinner conversation where he'd held court about hard work and vision and taking calculated risks. It had been funded, in its foundational moment, by the inheritance of the woman he'd publicly humiliated in front of 300 people at his own anniversary party. She had never mentioned it, not once, not in 14 years. He thought about the gala, the microphone, the way the room had gone quiet, the way she'd set down her glass of sparkling water and walked out without looking back. He thought about what she'd said in Reese's conference room, I stayed in a marriage for 9 years hoping things might change. He thought about the letter on his attorney's desk from Callaway and Reese. Formal notice that Vivian Hale, as majority shareholder of Ashford Capital, was exercising her right to call an emergency shareholders meeting. He thought about what it meant to spend a decade convinced you were the most powerful person in the room. He had been wrong about everything. Not about some things, not about the details. About everything. About who she was. About what she was capable of. About what she had been doing quietly, carefully, persistently, in the time he'd spent not looking at her. Outside the conference room window, the city went about its business. Indifferent. The same as always. Somewhere across town, in a small house with worn furniture and a kitchen table still marked from years of carefully stacked folders, Vivian Hale was probably doing something ordinary, making tea, reading something, moving through her day without any particular need for anyone to notice. Damien Ashford sat in the boardroom of his own company and understood, in a way that settled into his bones rather than his mind, that the woman he'd thrown out in the rain had never needed saving. She had needed him to stop underestimating her long enough to see what was actually in front of him. He hadn't managed it, and now the only question was how much of what he'd built would be left standing when the accounting was finally done. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for a Monday, which gave Damien 11 days to prepare, and he used all 11 of them badly. He hired a second legal team, a bigger firm, out of the city, the kind with marble lobbies and partners who billed at rates that made Marcus look affordable. And he had them review the convertible note, the equity conversion, the original operating agreement, every document touching the founding capitalization of Ashford Capital. He had them review it twice. He paid for the urgency surcharge without arguing about it. They came back with the same answer Forsyth had given him. The note was valid. The conversion was valid. Vivian Hale held controlling interest in the company he'd spent 14 years describing as entirely his own. He spent 3 of those 11 days trying to find a procedural angle, something that would delay the shareholders' meeting, something that would buy him time to reframe the situation, some technical defect in the notice or the documentation that would give him a foothold. His new attorneys filed 2 motions. Both were denied inside 48 hours. Judge Rafferty, who had also denied his earlier injunction, wrote in her second denial that the documentation supporting the shareholder claim was, and she used this phrase twice, unambiguous. By day 8, he'd stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night. His publicist Janet had managed, through some combination of carefully placed statements and the sheer volume of other news the world generated, to keep the story from going fully viral. There had been coverage, business press mostly, a few sharp takes in financial newsletters that he'd always read with the comfortable distance of someone who assumed such stories were always about other people. But it hadn't become the kind of thing that followed you into grocery stores yet. Janet told him that window was closing. Once the trial date was set publicly, she said, the tone would change. How bad? He asked her. Depends on the trial, she said, but based on what's publicly filed? Pretty bad, Damien. He'd been operating on the assumption, for most of his adult life, that image was something you could manage if you were skilled enough and moved quickly enough. He was discovering that image, like most things, had a structural limit, a point at which no amount of management could substitute for the underlying facts being different. He drove out to the estate on the 9th day. He wasn't supposed to, not technically, not under any specific order, but Marcus had strongly advised against it, and so had his new attorneys. And he'd agreed with them in the meeting and then driven out there anyway at 7 in the evening because he needed to see it. The driveway without the gates looked wrong in a way he hadn't anticipated. He'd driven through those gates thousands of times without registering them as something that defined the entrance, but their absence did something to the whole approach. Made it look provisional, temporary, like a set after the production has moved on. The house itself was dark, not the kind of dark that comes from people being in other rooms or going to sleep early, the kind of dark that comes from a building that isn't occupied. Every light was off. The fountain had been shut down. The basin sat still and flat. The exterior landscape lights, the ones that had always given the limestone face a particular warm quality at night, were dark. He parked and got out and stood in the driveway for a moment, just looking. The electricity had been an ongoing dispute, complicated by the utility company's caution and the competing claims, and apparently it had resolved itself, or been resolved, while he'd been spending 11 days in conference rooms. He pulled out his phone and called Tyler. "The estate is dark," he said when Tyler answered. "What happened with the utility situation?" A pause that told him Tyler knew more than he'd been told to share. "The utility company sent a formal notice last Friday. They need a new easement agreement signed by the trust before they can continue service to the property. The trust's attorneys indicated they weren't prepared to execute a new agreement until the property claim is adjudicated. And nobody told me. Marcus said he was going to—" Tyler stopped. "I'm sorry, I thought you knew." He stood in the dark driveway for another moment, phone at his side. The October air was cold now in a way it hadn't been 3 weeks ago. He hadn't brought a coat. He went to the front door anyway. He had a key. Whatever else had shifted in his world, the house itself was still legally his structure, his building, and his key still worked. He pushed the door open and stood in the entryway. The smell hit him first. Not rot, not damage, just the particular smell of a house with its systems shut down. Still air, the absence of the HVAC cycling, the faint staleness of rooms that haven't been ventilated. He walked through the foyer. His footsteps echoed in a way they never had when the house was full of sound and life and the white noise of appliances running. The marble floors that had seemed grand now just felt cold. He walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator was off. Someone had emptied and propped it open. He didn't know who, maybe the staff who'd been given notice, maybe Tyler, handling logistics he hadn't been kept current on. He walked into the study. His desk was still there, the reclaimed timber custom piece, and the built-in shelves still held his books, but the laptop that usually sat on the desk was gone, and the framed photographs on the shelves, the ones with politicians and celebrities and business leaders, the visual catalog of a life spent accumulating proximity to power, looked different in the dark and the silence. Smaller, maybe. More like what they were, which was just photographs. He sat down in his own chair. He sat there for a long time. Quote, the shareholders' meeting was not the catastrophe he'd most feared, which made it somehow worse than if it had been. Catastrophes you could react to. What happened instead was procedural and methodical and utterly final. Vivian arrived with Sandra Reese and 2 additional attorneys from Callaway and Reese, plus a forensic accountant named Dr. Patricia Osai, who had apparently been retained as an expert consultant. They were not theatrical about it. They sat on one side of the table. Damien's team sat on the other. The remaining board members, 5 of them, people who had been in business with Damien for years, sat in various states of carefully managed neutrality. The board had its own attorney present, a sign that the members were protecting themselves rather than him, which told him everything he needed to know about where their loyalties had migrated. Sandra Reese opened by formally establishing Vivian's standing as controlling shareholder, entered the documentation into the record, and stated clearly that the purpose of the meeting was to address the governance implications of the shareholder structure given the current legal proceedings. One of the board members, a man named Gerald Holt, who had been with Ashford Capital for 9 years, and who Damien had always considered one of his steadiest allies, spoke first. Given the pending federal charges and the questions about the company's capitalization history, the board believes it's appropriate to discuss transition of executive authority. Damien looked at him. Gerald. Gerald looked back with the expression of a man who had made a difficult decision and was committed to it. I'm sorry, Damien, but we have a fiduciary responsibility. The charges alone create liability exposure that the board can't. The charges are pending. I haven't been convicted of anything. We understand that, Gerald said, but the documentation that's been entered into the federal record has been shared with the board under discovery, and he stopped. There are transactions that we were not aware of, that we should have been aware of, and we have an obligation to the company's investors to— You're removing me from my own company. His voice came out flat. Sandra Reese said, Ms. Hale, as controlling shareholder, wishes to propose an interim executive structure pending resolution of the legal proceedings. This is standard corporate governance practice in situations where— I know what it is, Damien said. The room went quiet. He looked at Vivian. She hadn't spoken yet. She'd let her attorneys handle the mechanics of it, which was strategic and also very like her. She met his eyes without apology. "You could have said something," he said, "in the room with Hendricks and Park. You could have asked them to consider Damien." Her voice was level. "What would I have asked them to consider?" "Context, mitigating factors, the way the business operated." "The way the business operated is what they're charging you with." She folded her hands on the table in front of her. "I didn't build a case against you because I wanted to hurt you. I built it because $40 million moved through that company in ways that hurt real people. Investors who put their retirement savings into Ashford Development Funds, a pension organization that lost nearly $2 million on the Lakeview bond offering. Those people don't get their money back because there was context." He looked at her for a long moment. "You always had more of a conscience than I gave you credit for." "You didn't give me credit for much," she said. Not bitterly, just as a fact. Gerald cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should proceed with the formal vote." The vote took 4 minutes. All 5 board members voted in favor of the interim executive transition. Vivian, as controlling shareholder, ratified the resolution. The interim structure placed an independent executive committee in operational control of Ashford Capital, pending the outcome of the federal proceedings. Damien Ashford left his own company's boardroom without a title for the first time in 14 years. Marcus walked beside him in the elevator down, silent, not offering anything because there was nothing useful to offer. The asset repossession began in earnest the following week. It was not, as Damien had half expected, dramatic. There were no trucks showing up to haul furniture. What happened was more methodical than that. Formal notices from the Hale Family Trust's attorneys identifying each asset that had been purchased using funds traceable to trust-adjacent accounts, including the investment returns from Vivian's original capital contribution over the years of the company's operation. The trust position, supported by Dr. Osei's forensic accounting analysis, was that a proportional share of every acquisition made through Ashford Capital during the relevant period carried the trust's equity fingerprint. This included 3 investment properties in the downtown corridor, a commercial development in the East District that was currently generating rental income, 2 parcels of undeveloped land that Damien had been holding for a planned project, and the estate. The mansion itself was different from the land legally because Damien did own the structure, but the trust's position on the estate had evolved through the utility dispute and the property proceedings into something more comprehensive. Sandra Reese's team filed a formal claim arguing that without the utility easements and land access controlled by the trust, the structure was, and they used a specific legal term here, that Damien's attorneys found technically accurate and practically devastating, functionally uninhabitable as a private residence. The County Code Enforcement Office, acting on a separate referral that had come through the property dispute filings, sent an inspector to assess the estate in its current state. The inspector found that without active utility connections, the structure failed to meet minimum habitability standards. He issued a notice. Marcus brought it to Damien over the phone on a Thursday afternoon. "It's a condemnation notice," he said. "Not demolition? Not yet. Just an official finding that the property can't be legally occupied in its current state. Because she cut the power. Because the utility easement dispute has left the property without service." A pause. "Damien, I want to be straightforward with you about where things stand. The federal case is proceeding, the corporate situation is what it is, the property, tell me. Your liquid assets are tied up in the bail bond and the initial federal defense costs. The investment properties are subject to trust claims. The estate is condemned. The business is under interim management." He paused again, and this pause had weight in it. "I've been your attorney for 11 years. I need to tell you that I think you should consider a plea." Silence. "They have everything," Marcus said quietly. "They have it in Vivian's documentation, and they have it in the subpoenaed records, and they have Dr. Osei's analysis. The forensic accounting alone is... I've shown it to 3 different people, and they all say the same thing. It's thorough, Damien. It's very thorough." Damien was standing in Tyler's apartment, which was where he'd been staying for the past week because the estate was uninhabitable and his downtown condo was subject to a lien related to the federal proceedings, and he'd needed somewhere to go. Tyler had offered without being asked, which Damien hadn't known what to do with, and had accepted more awkwardly than he wanted to admit. "I need to think," Damien said. Of course, Marcus said. But don't take too long. He didn't take too long. 2 days later, he told Marcus to open plea discussions with the federal prosecutors. Not because he'd accepted it emotionally. He hadn't, quite. He was still somewhere in the territory between rage and resignation, moving between them depending on the hour. But because Marcus was right. They had everything. Vivian had given them everything. The plea negotiation took 6 weeks. Damien's attorneys pushed for the best terms they could construct from the available leverage, which was not much. The prosecutors, for their part, were not punitive in their approach. They had what they needed for a conviction at trial, but trials were expensive and uncertain, and a negotiated resolution served their interests too. In the end, the plea covered 3 of the original 7 charges. The sentencing range was significant. When Marcus explained the final terms, Damien sat with it for a long time before he signed anything. Is this the best we can do? Yes, Marcus said simply. It is. He signed. He went back to the estate one more time before sentencing. He didn't know why exactly. He wasn't a sentimental person, or he hadn't thought of himself as one. But he drove out there on a gray November afternoon and parked in the open driveway and sat for a while looking at the house. He got out and walked around the perimeter. The grounds were still technically maintained. Some arrangement had been made to keep the landscaping from completely deteriorating during the legal proceedings. But the house itself, dark and silent behind its tall windows, had begun to take on the quality of a thing that knew it was ending. Leaves had accumulated against the front steps in a way they never would have been allowed to when the household staff was active. One of the ground floor window edges had developed a smear of moisture, the beginning of something that would become a problem if left unaddressed, which it would be. He stood on the back terrace, where he used to have his coffee on mornings when the weather was good, looking out over the 9 acres that had belonged to Eleanor Hale's trust for 50 years, and that would never belong to him and had never, legally, quite done so. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize at first, and then did. The area code was the same as the small house 30 minutes away. The trust has filed the demolition authorization for the structure. My attorneys say it'll proceed after sentencing. I thought you should hear it from me. He stood on the terrace and read the text twice. Then he typed back, "Why are you demolishing it? You could sell it." 3 minutes passed. Then, "I don't want to sell it. I know what this place cost." He read that and wasn't entirely sure what she meant. The financial cost? The personal cost? The cost measured in the years they'd both spent inside these walls in various states of distance from each other. Probably all of it. He put his phone in his pocket. The house was quiet around him in the way of things that are over. Not peaceful, just finished. He'd built it to announce something, to declare something about who he was and what he'd made of himself, and it had done that job for a decade, and now it was going to come down and whatever it had announced would come down with it. He walked back to his car. He didn't look back this time, which surprised him. He'd half expected to, had braced for some pull of it. But there wasn't one. The house was just a building. It had always been just a building. He drove back toward the city through the gray November afternoon and thought about the gala, 10 years and 1 month ago, and the look on Vivian's face when he'd taken the microphone. He'd read it as passivity at the time, the particular blankness of someone caught off guard, overwhelmed, not sure what to do. He understood it now for what it had actually been. She had been watching him close a door she had spent 9 years waiting for him to close. She had been watching him do, in front of 300 witnesses, exactly what she had known he would eventually do. She had been watching him hand her the one thing she'd needed that she couldn't build herself, the public moment, the undeniable act, the documentation that the marriage had ended not because she'd manufactured a crisis, but because he had walked to a microphone and chosen to. He had thought he was winning. He had been, from the moment he picked up that microphone, simply finishing something she had prepared for with extraordinary patience and without a single wasted move. The city appeared ahead of him through the windshield. He drove into it, smaller than he had been in a very long time. The sentencing happened on a Wednesday in late January, in a federal courtroom that smelled like old carpet and forced air heat, before a judge named Calloway, who was not related to Vivian's attorneys, and who had the reputation of being neither harsh nor lenient, but precise. Someone who read the room through the documents, rather than through the theater of it. Damien sat at the defense table in a suit he'd worn to board meetings, which felt like the wrong choice only after he was already wearing it. Marcus sat beside him. The prosecution table was organized and quiet. The gallery was about half full. Some press, a few business associates who had come for reasons he couldn't entirely decipher, Gerald Holt from the board sitting in the third row with an expression of uncomfortable duty. Vivian was not there. He'd half expected her to be. He'd prepared himself in some vague way for the experience of being sentenced while she watched. But the seat he'd somehow reserved for her in his imagination was empty, and he sat with that absence for a moment before the judge entered and everyone stood. The proceedings took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The judge read through the factual basis for the plea, the agreed-upon guidelines calculation, the government's sentencing recommendation, the defense's response. Damien's attorney made a statement about his client's acknowledgement of responsibility and his years of community involvement and the genuine harm that incarceration would cause to, Marcus had written this section carefully, the employees and stakeholders of Ashford Capital whose interests Damien still cared about. Damien had read that section of the statement the night before and sat with the particular discomfort of hearing his own name attached to words like responsibility and harm in that order. He hadn't asked Marcus to change it because it was true, even if it sat badly. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in federal prison, with eligibility for early release after 5 subject to conduct and the completion of restitution requirements. The restitution figure, the amount to be paid back to defrauded investors, calculated by Dr. Osei's forensic analysis and accepted by both parties in the plea, was $38 million to be paid from the asset liquidation that was already underway. Marcus had told him to expect something in this range. Knowing what to expect and hearing it spoken aloud in a federal courtroom were different experiences. He was remanded immediately. There was a brief moment, a few seconds maybe, between the judge's gavel and the marshal approaching the defense table, and in that moment Damien sat very still and looked at his own hands on the table in front of him and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for a man who had spent most of his adult life thinking about the next thing. Marcus squeezed his shoulder once, awkwardly, which was more human than Damien would have expected from him. Then the marshal came, and the cuffs went on, and Damien Ashford was led out of the courtroom through a side door into a hallway that smelled like nothing at all. The demolition of the Ashford estate took 4 days in February. Vivian didn't watch it. She'd considered it. She'd even driven out there on the first morning, sat in her car at the county road while the equipment moved up the driveway, watched one excavator position itself near the east wing, and then she'd driven away without getting out. Not because it hurt, exactly. More because she didn't want to be the kind of person who watched. She'd spent enough time watching things she couldn't change. This was something she'd chosen, and she didn't need to witness every moment of it to know it was real. Caroline came over that evening with wine and take-out Thai food, and the good sense not to ask how Vivian was doing with performative concern. "It's down?" Caroline asked, setting the food containers on the kitchen table. Eleanor's kitchen table, worn at the edges from years of exactly this kind of ordinary evening. "2 wings," Vivian said. "They'll finish the main structure by Thursday." "And you're, I'm fine." She paused. "I'm actually fine this time, not the other kind." Caroline looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, what's the plan for the land?" "I've been talking to the county parks department. There's a wildlife corridor initiative. They've been trying to connect 2 existing preserves on either side of the estate parcel for years, but the private ownership was always the obstacle." She opened a container of pad thai and didn't quite look up. 11 acres would complete the connection. The trust would deed it to the county as a permanent conservation easement. "A wildlife preserve," Caroline said. "A small one. It's not like it becomes a national park. But the corridor matters. There are species that can't move between the preserves right now because the land is fragmented." She finally looked up. Grandma Eleanor bought that land because she said land was the one thing they couldn't make more of. She never wanted a mansion on it. Caroline was quiet for a moment. "She'd like this better." "I think so." They ate in the comfortable silence of people who had known each other long enough that silence wasn't something to fill. Outside, February rain came down on the roof of the small house. the same roof it had been coming down on for 50 years. Vivian had started Hale Forensic Partners 8 months before Damien's arrest, registered quietly under her restored name, operating initially out of the back room of a small office she sublet from a law firm that did estate work. She hadn't announced it or marketed it in those early months. She'd simply done work for 3 clients referred through Harold Briggs's network, clients who had come to her with complicated financial situations and left with clear answers and a plan. Word moved in those networks the way it always did, through trust rather than advertising, and by the time Damien's trial coverage had cycled through its news cycle, Vivian had 6 clients and a waiting list and a quiet reputation in a specific community: attorneys, trust officers, financial advocates. As someone who could find what was hidden in numbers with a kind of methodical patience that most people couldn't sustain. She hired her first employee in March. Her name was Keisha, 29 years old, 6 months out of her graduate forensic accounting program, who had read about the Ashford case in a financial news digest and sent Vivian a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, mailed to the office address, asking if there were any opportunities to learn from someone who'd done what she'd done. Vivian had read the letter twice, thought about what it had felt like to be 29 with a skill set and nowhere obvious to put it, and called the number at the bottom. Keisha turned out to be sharp and fast and occasionally impatient, which Vivian recognized as a thing that could go either way, depending on whether the person learned to control it. She told Keisha that in their first week. Keisha looked briefly startled, then said, "Fair," and they'd worked together reasonably well ever since. By the end of the first year, Hale Forensic Partners had 11 clients and a focused mission that Vivian had written herself in 2 sentences on a note card above her desk. Find what's been hidden. Return what was taken. She didn't put anything else on the note card because she didn't need to. The work was specific. It was the thing she'd been training for, in the most sideways and unplanned way imaginable, for her entire adult life. The wildlife preserve opened on a Saturday in May, 2 years after the demolition. It wasn't a ceremony so much as an opening. A few county officials, some representatives from the Parks Department, Caroline and her firm, who had done the landscape design work pro bono, Harold Briggs, who arrived in a car driven by his granddaughter and walked the entrance path slowly with a cane, and the expression of a man who had been holding something in trust for a very long time and was glad to finally set it down. Vivian had worked with the county on the signage. The preserve was officially named the Eleanor Hale Wildlife Corridor. A small plaque at the entrance read, "Dedicated to the memory of Eleanor Hale, who believed that land held in trust is land held for everyone." Harold stopped in front of the plaque for a long moment. "She would have complained about the font," he said finally. Vivian laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised her. She would have wanted something simpler. She would have wanted her name smaller. He looked at the plaque a moment longer. She was never interested in being seen, just in things being done right. He glanced at Vivian. "Where do you suppose she got that from?" Vivian didn't answer, but she put her hand briefly on his arm, and he covered it with his own weathered hand, and they stood there for a moment in the May morning while the corridor stretched away behind the plaque into trees that were already beginning to look like they'd been there forever. She heard about Damien indirectly and intermittently, the way you heard about people who had been significant and then became peripheral. Marcus Webb sent her a formal note when the restitution payments began processing. She was copied on certain financial notifications as part of the ongoing legal administration, and she learned through that channel that the asset liquidation was proceeding and that the investor restitution fund was being distributed in tranches. She thought about the investors sometimes, the pension organization that had lost $2 million, the individual investors who had put retirement savings into Ashford development funds and gotten back fractions. She'd met a few of them through the restitution process, not face-to-face, but through correspondence, through the legal apparatus of the recovery proceedings. One woman had written a letter to the court that Vivian had seen in the public record, a retired school administrator from outside the city who had invested her husband's life insurance payout in an Ashford fund because the materials had described it as conservative and stable. Vivian had read that letter 3 times. She still thought about it. She didn't know if what she'd done had given that woman's money back in full. The restitution fund covered a percentage, not everything. That was the reality of fraud at that scale. The money was gone, dispersed, converted into things that had been sold at fractions of their value, and no legal process fully reversed that. You could hold people accountable. You couldn't always make the harm disappear. That was the part she lived with. Not regret about her choices. She'd made them clearly, and she'd make them again. But the understanding that accountability and repair weren't the same thing, and that the gap between them was where real people lived. 3 years into his sentence, Damien was transferred to a minimum security facility about 90 miles from the city, which everyone in the system understood as a sign that his conduct had been unproblematic and his trajectory was toward the early release eligibility he'd been promised. He worked in the facility's administrative office, doing data entry and basic records management, which was unglamorous and which he had initially resisted in the way of a man who had never done unglamorous work, and which he eventually stopped resisting because resistance was exhausting and the work was just work. He read a lot. He'd always read business books, strategy texts, the kind of reading that was really just refueling for the next thing, but in the facility he read differently, without agenda. History, biography, occasionally fiction, which he'd dismissed for most of his adult life as a luxury he couldn't justify, and which turned out to be the thing he found himself returning to most. He had few visitors. His social world had organized itself in the years before his arrest around proximity to his power, and power, once removed, turned out to be a poor foundation for the kind of relationship that survives a federal sentence. Gerald Holt had sent a card at Christmas the first year, a generic one, no personal note. A few other names from his former life had sent similarly careful, deniable gestures of acknowledgement. Tyler visited twice in the first year. That surprised Damien. He hadn't expected it and hadn't asked for it, and he didn't know what to do with it on either occasion, and both visits were somewhat awkward in the way of two people who had been employer and employee and were now something without a clear category. But Tyler had come, and that meant something, even if Damien couldn't quite name what. He didn't ask anyone to contact Vivian. He had no claim on her attention, and he knew it, and the clarity of that, the acceptance of it, was something that arrived slowly and wasn't entirely comfortable when it did. The letter from Eleanor Hale came through Marcus Webb's office in the 4th year of Damien's sentence. It had been in the files from the original Hale Family Trust documentation, a sealed envelope with Damien Ashford's name on it, in handwriting that was old and careful, placed by Harold Briggs with instructions that it be delivered to Damien directly and not opened by anyone else. Briggs had included a note of his own explaining that Eleanor had left the letter decades ago with instructions specific enough that he'd felt obligated to honor them, even across the years and the circumstances. The letter reached Damien through the facility's mail system. He held it for 2 days before he opened it. Eleanor Hale had written it 15 years before her death, which meant she'd written it before Vivian met Damien, before the marriage, before any of what followed. It was 2 pages in the same careful handwriting as the envelope, and it began without preamble, the way very direct people sometimes write when they're not worrying about how they'll be received. She wrote that she'd decided to leave this letter in trust for whoever might one day need to read it, by which she meant whoever found themselves at the intersection of her family's land and a set of choices they'd made badly. She wrote that she didn't know who that person would be and that she'd tried to write it in a way that would apply regardless. She wrote about the land, about how she'd bought it not as an investment, but because she understood at 30 years old that the world would keep subdividing and developing everything it could get access to, and that there were things worth protecting not for their financial value, but for what they represented. Continuity. Roots. The idea that some things should survive beyond the person who established them. She wrote about her granddaughter, not sentimentally. Eleanor's tone throughout was measured, practical. The voice of a woman who had learned that sentiment without action was just feeling sorry for yourself. She wrote that Vivian was the most capable person she had known in 70 years, and that she was also, at her worst, too patient, that she would wait too long on people she believed could change rather than accepting earlier that some people only changed when they had no other option. She wrote, "Whoever you are reading this, you had a choice, somewhere back there, probably more than one. The land and the money and the legal architecture are just the structure of what happened. The real thing underneath it is simpler and harder. You looked at a person and decided they didn't matter. People who do that are rarely right, and they're never as safe as they think they are. She wrote, "I don't know if you're capable of understanding that yet. Most people aren't until they've lost something they can't get back. If you're reading this letter, I imagine you've lost several things." She wrote, "I'm not angry at you. I can't be. I don't know you. But I hope this finds you somewhere you can still use it." She signed it with her name and the date, 15 years before it arrived. Damien read the letter in the facility's common room on a Thursday afternoon, sitting at a table near the window with the flat particular light of a late autumn day coming through the glass. He read it once through and then sat with it, and then read it again. He'd been in the facility for 4 years. He'd had a significant amount of time to think. He'd thought about the business, about the transactions, about the choices he'd made in each specific instance and the reasoning he'd used to make them. He'd thought about the investors, about Gerald and Tyler and Marcus and the employees of Ashford Capital who'd had to navigate a company in collapse without having caused any of it. He'd thought about his own story, the version he'd told himself about who he was and what he'd built, and how much of that story, when you stripped out the parts he'd invented, was actually left. What he hadn't let himself think about, or hadn't been able to, was the simpler and harder thing Eleanor had identified. Not the fraud. The fraud was its own reckoning, terrible and real and his, but the thing beneath it. The daily accumulated small decision to look at Vivian and see decoration. Convenience. Something managed rather than someone known. He'd made that decision so many times, across so many years, that he'd stopped experiencing it as a decision. It had become just the texture of how he moved through the world. The assumption that the quiet people, the careful people, the people who organized the caterers and drove themselves in gray sedans and never demanded anything, the assumption that those people were essentially inert, background, available for use but not requiring genuine attention. He'd been wrong about that in the most comprehensive way possible. And the thing Eleanor's letter landed on, the thing he sat with for a long time at that table in the flat autumn light, was that the wrongness wasn't just tactical. It wasn't just that underestimating Vivian had cost him the company and the house and the years. It was that he'd spent 10 years married to a person he'd chosen not to know. Whatever Vivian had been, whatever she was, the real specific complicated human reality of her, he'd decided it wasn't worth the attention. He'd lived alongside it for a decade and never looked at it directly. That was the loss he hadn't yet fully accounted for. Not the money, not the buildings, not the title. The 10 years of a person he could have known and didn't. He folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. He was released on a Monday morning in April, 5 years and 3 months into his sentence. Early release approved on the basis of conduct and the completion of restitution obligations from the asset liquidation. Marcus had managed to recover and pay the required figure, $38 million across 5 years, from the estate and the company assets and the investment properties and the various liquidations. And the legal machinery had processed this and produced on the other side a release date. A release date was not a restoration. That was something Damien had understood in the abstract for years and understood differently now. Stepping out of the facility into a parking lot on a Monday morning in April with a bag that contained his few possessions and a check representing his facility account balance that was a small and specific number. Marcus had arranged a ride. The driver was someone from a car service, not Tyler. Tyler had gone on, sensibly, gotten a different job 3 years ago, was apparently doing well. Marcus had mentioned this in a neutral way that Damien had received as intended. The driver took him to a motel in the city, a modest one, the kind that had a breakfast room with a waffle machine and a small pool behind a chain-link fence. Marcus had paid for the first week. He stood in the motel room and looked at the standard furniture and the view of the parking lot and the interstate beyond it, and felt something he didn't have a precise word for. Not grief, not relief, something that occupied the space between them. He was 61 years old. He was, by any measure that had organized his life for the previous 30 years, finished. He was also, by some other measure that he was still learning to use, just standing in a room at the beginning of something he hadn't defined yet. He found the cleaning job through a placement service that worked with released federal inmates, an organization staffed by people who were matter-of-fact about the situation in a way he found, after initial resistance, genuinely easier than sympathy. The job was night cleaning at a commercial mall on the east side of the city. 6 nights a week, 9 in the evening until 3 in the morning, a crew of 7 covering 2 levels and the food court. The crew supervisor was a woman named Berta, who was 54 and had been doing this work for 12 years, and who told him on his first night, with the calm authority of someone who has no patience for complications, that she didn't care who people had been before they got here, only whether they showed up and did the work correctly. He showed up. He did the work correctly. The food court, in the hours after the mall closed, had a particular quality that he hadn't anticipated. Quiet in a way that large empty spaces sometimes weren't. The sound of the cleaning machines and the echo of the floor and the ambient hum of the ventilation giving it an almost meditative texture. He pushed the floor machine through the patterns Berta had shown him, and he thought, or didn't think, depending on the night, and the hours passed the way hours passed when you weren't managing them. He wasn't a reformed man in the way of stories that needed him to be. He was a man who was 61 years old and had done considerable damage and was now cleaning a food court at midnight and paying back the restitution balance from his wages according to the structured payment agreement the court had ordered. He had some clarity he hadn't had before. He had some things he was still working out. He didn't believe he was owed a redemption narrative, and he was suspicious of the version of himself that might reach for one. He thought about Eleanor's letter on those nights sometimes, about the phrase she'd used, "I hope this finds you somewhere you can still use it." He didn't know yet what he could still use. He was finding out. The thing about Vivian Hale, the thing that people who worked with her talked about, the thing that Keisha mentioned once to a colleague in a way that got back to Vivian and made her uncomfortable, was that she didn't talk about what had happened. Not the marriage, not the case, not Damien. In the 3 years since Hale Forensic Partners had established itself, she had given 2 interviews for trade publications, both focused on methodology and the firm's specific approach to financial abuse cases. And in neither of them had she mentioned her own history beyond a single sentence acknowledging that her work was informed by personal experience. She had a reason for this that she didn't always explain. The story of what she'd done, the patience, the preparation, the long, careful accumulation of evidence, could be told in a way that made it sound like revenge. And she'd found, once the dust had settled and she could look at it without the fog of living through it, that revenge wasn't what it had been. Revenge required the other person to suffer in a way that satisfied you. She'd never found Damien's suffering satisfying. She'd found it sad and deserved, and also, in some quiet corner she didn't visit often, genuinely painful. Because he was a person she had once chosen, and the person she had chosen had turned out to be someone who could do what he'd done, and there was a version of grief in that which didn't have a clean category. What she'd done was closer to accounting, not the financial kind, but the other kind. The kind where you take stock of what actually happened and what it cost and who was owed what, and you try, to the best of your ability and within the limits of what any person can actually accomplish, to make it more correct than it was. She didn't always succeed. The retired school administrator who'd lost her husband's life insurance payout had gotten back 63 cents on the dollar. That was what the fund had covered. Vivian knew the woman's name. She thought about her sometimes when the work felt clean or finished, as a reminder that it wasn't. She found the envelope in a box of her grandmother's papers that she'd been meaning to go through for 2 years and kept putting off. It was a Saturday afternoon in the fall, 4th year after the trial, and she'd finally pulled the box from the closet and sat cross-legged on the floor of Eleanor's bedroom. Her bedroom now, though she still thought of it as Eleanor's, and started going through it. Most of the box was what she'd expected. Old correspondence, property records, some photographs she'd seen before and some she hadn't. Notes in Eleanor's handwriting on various subjects. Eleanor had been a prolific note-taker, believing that the physical act of writing things down was how you committed to them. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope addressed to Vivian. Not formal, just her name in Eleanor's handwriting, first name only, the way Eleanor had always addressed things to her. She opened it. Eleanor had written 2 pages. She'd written them, the date at the top indicated, in the last year of her life, which meant she'd known she was dying or suspected it in the way older people sometimes do before the doctors have confirmed it. She wrote about the land. She wrote about the trust. She wrote, and this was the part that made Vivian sit very still, that she knew Vivian had discovered the title situation because Harold had told her, and that she was glad, not because she'd wanted anything to happen with it, but because she'd always believed Vivian should know what she had. She wrote, "I don't know what your life looks like right now. I don't know who's in it or what you're carrying. I never knew how to ask you directly. That was always my limitation with you. I let you be quiet when I should have pressed. You're like me that way, which means I know exactly how much you can carry without showing it, and I wish I'd pushed you harder to put some of it down sooner." She wrote, "The land is yours. Not because I gave it to you. I did, but that's not the point. It's yours because you understand what it's for. Some things in this world are meant to be held in trust for people who come after, and the people who understand that are the ones who should be holding them." She wrote, "Whatever you've done with your life by the time you read this, I hope some of it surprised you. I hope some of it was hard in the way of things that were worth doing. I hope you found something that was yours to do and did it without waiting for anyone to tell you you could." She signed it, "With everything, Eleanor." Vivian sat on the floor of her grandmother's bedroom for a long time after she finished reading. The house was quiet around her, the particular quiet of a Saturday afternoon in fall, leaves coming down outside the window, the muffled sound of the neighborhood going about its weekend, the worn furniture, the kitchen where Eleanor had cooked and where Vivian had sat at the table with her folders in the years when all of this was still being assembled. She'd surprised herself, yes. The firm, the preserve, the way things had landed after years of not knowing where they would. She'd also found the thing that was hers to do, and done it without waiting. That was true. It had cost things that mattered, and taken longer than it should have, and hadn't resolved cleanly in the way of stories where everything comes out right. But it was true. She folded the letter back into the envelope and held it in both hands for a moment. Outside, the fall afternoon continued. The skikiyats. Somewhere in the city, the work continued. The clients who needed someone to find what was hidden, the investors still waiting for their fractions, the new files on Keisha's desk that would take weeks of careful reading to understand. The Eleanor Hale Wildlife Corridor was resting under an October sky, 11 acres stitching two preserves together, something moving through it now that couldn't have moved through it before, a path that hadn't existed until someone decided to clear the obstruction. Vivian Hale sat on the floor of her grandmother's bedroom, holding a letter that had waited years to reach her, and felt the specific weight of a life that had been hard in exactly the way Eleanor had hoped, the way of things that were worth doing. She wasn't finished. There was too much work left for finished to be the right word, but she was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where she was supposed to be, and that was enough.